The handshake that shook the world when dignity defeated diplomacy. Picture this: the most powerful assembly hall in the world, where nations have declared wars, forged peace treaties, and reshaped the global order for nearly 8 decades. The United Nations General Assembly has witnessed countless historic moments, but what unfolded on this particular day would redefine diplomatic protocol forever. The atmosphere was electric with tension. You could feel it the moment you stepped into that cavernous chamber. 193 nations represented, thousands of eyes focused on one man, and a silence so profound it seemed to press against your chest. Benjamin Netanyahu, the seasoned Israeli prime minister who had addressed this very assembly dozens of times before, sat rigidly at his delegation's table. His usual confident demeanor was nowhere to be found. Instead, his shoulders carried the weight of a man who knew he was walking into the most critical moment of his political career. But let's rewind for a moment. How did we get here? What could possibly bring one of the world's most experienced politicians to this breaking point? 3 days earlier, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso had done something unprecedented. In a move that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles from Washington to Moscow, from Beijing to Brussels, he had issued an ultimatum that no African leader had ever dared to make. Not a request, not a diplomatic note, but an ultimatum. Netanyahu had exactly 72 hours to publicly apologize for remarks that had insulted not just Burkina Faso, but the entire African continent. The alternative? Africa would begin systematically severing diplomatic ties with Israel, a move that would isolate one of the Middle East's most influential nations from an entire continent of 54 countries and over 1.4 billion people. The insult itself had been devastating in its casual cruelty. During a private meeting that had somehow been recorded and leaked, Netanyahu had dismissed African intelligence capabilities, questioned the competence of African leadership, and made remarks so condescending that even his own diplomatic staff had reportedly cringed. When the recording surfaced, it wasn't just Burkina Faso that was outraged. It was every African nation, every person of African descent worldwide, and every individual who understood that respect isn't negotiable in international relations. Now, those 72 hours had expired, and the entire world was watching that Netanyahu rose from his seat. The usual diplomatic murmurs that typically filled such moments were conspicuously absent. Even the translators seemed to hold their breath. His aides, men and women who had navigated countless international crises, looked as though they had aged years in mere hours. Their faces betrayed what everyone in that room was thinking. This was uncharted territory. The Israeli prime minister approached the podium with measured steps, each footfall echoing in the unnaturally quiet chamber. His hands, usually steady and confident during public addresses, showed the slightest tremor as he adjusted the microphone. The weight of global attention, of diplomatic consequences, of potential international isolation, all of it converged on this single moment, and then he began to speak. President Traoré, Netanyahu's voice carried across the assembly hall, and to the great people of Burkina Faso, here it was, the moment the world had been waiting for. Would one of the most powerful leaders in the Middle East humble himself before an African president? Would pride give way to pragmatism? If there was any misunderstanding, any perception of insult, it was never my intention. The words hung in the air like smoke, and you could almost feel the collective disappointment ripple through the chamber. If there was any misunderstanding, not an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but a deflection. Any perception of insult, not recognition of actual insult, but dismissal of others' interpretations. It was never my intention, not accountability, but excuse-making. For nearly 4 excruciating minutes, Netanyahu continued in this vein. He spoke of shared values between nations that he had just insulted. He mentioned regional cooperation with a continent he had dismissed. He used phrases like mutual understanding and diplomatic dialogue, while avoiding the 2 words that could have changed everything: I apologize. The delegates from across Africa sat stone-faced. Representatives from Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana, Egypt, nation after nation of leaders who had flown thousands of miles expecting to hear accountability, instead witnessed what felt like the most elaborate non-apology in diplomatic history. But Netanyahu wasn't finished. In what would later be analyzed as either a desperate political calculation or a catastrophic misjudgment, he did something that revealed just how disconnected he was from the gravity of the moment. He extended his hand toward the section where President Traoré sat with the African delegations. That it was a gesture that had worked countless times before. The symbolic handshake, the photo opportunity that would allow headlines to read "Leaders Reconcile" or "Diplomatic Crisis Averted." For decades, this move had been Netanyahu's political insurance policy. Extend the hand, smile for the cameras. Let the media focus on the gesture rather than the substance. But this time was different. President Ibrahim Traoré, a man who had come to power through a revolution, who had survived military coups, who had faced down international pressure, and emerged stronger, looked directly at Netanyahu. For a moment that felt like an eternity, their eyes met across that vast chamber. The younger African leader, representing not just his nation but the dignity of an entire continent, made a choice that would be remembered for generations. That he stood up. The movement was deliberate, controlled, powerful. Every person in that assembly hall, every camera operator, every journalist, every diplomat, all eyes followed President Traoré as he rose to his full height. And then, in the most eloquent response in diplomatic history, he turned his back on Netanyahu and walked away in no words. No speeches, no dramatic declarations. Just the simple, devastating act of walking away from disrespect. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was thunderous in its completeness. You could hear the soft echo of Traoré's footsteps on the marble floor, the rustle of his delegation's clothing as they followed him, the subtle mechanical whir of cameras capturing what would become one of the most iconic images in modern international relations. Netanyahu stood frozen, his hands still extended into empty space, his face a portrait of a man who had just witnessed his own political mortality. The most powerful handshake gesture in his arsenal had been rejected, not with anger, not with shouting, but with the simple dignity of turning away. Security personnel flanked President Traoré as he moved toward the exit, but their presence seemed almost unnecessary. This wasn't a man fleeing in anger. This was a leader making a statement. His head was held high, his pace unhurried, his expression serene. He had said everything he needed to say without uttering a single word. Outside the assembly hall, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing, voices calling out in multiple languages. "Mr. President, why didn't you respond? To the Prime Minister? Will you reconsider diplomatic relations? What's your message to Israel?" President Traoré paused just once, turned to face the media scrum, and delivered what would become one of the most quoted statements in modern diplomacy. Africa does not shake hands with disrespect. 5 words, 28 letters. A statement that would reshape international relations and echo through history. Within hours, that single video clip had exploded across every social media platform on Earth. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. The footage of President Traoré walking away from Netanyahu's extended hand was everywhere. The hashtag #TraorWalksAway began trending in over 20 countries within 6 hours. By the end of the first day, the clip had been viewed over 38 million times. But this wasn't just viral content. This was a cultural earthquake. In Kenya, university students poured onto the streets of Nairobi, carrying signs that read, "Respect is earned, not begged." Their chants echoed through the capital as they marched toward the Israeli embassy, their voices united in support of dignified leadership. In Nigeria, artists worked through the night to create murals depicting President Traoré walking away from a crumbling wall bearing Netanyahu's image. These works of art appeared on buildings from Lagos to Abuja, each one a testament to the power of principled action. In South Africa, the scene was even more remarkable. Thousands of protesters gathered outside the Israeli consulate in Cape Town. But instead of shouting or chanting, they stood in complete silence for exactly 72 minutes. 1 minute for each hour of the deadline that Netanyahu had ignored. The image of thousands of people standing in perfect, dignified silence became almost as powerful as the original UN footage. Across the Atlantic in Paris, the African diaspora community organized what they called the Walk of Dignity. Hundreds of young people of African descent gathered in front of the Israeli embassy, and one by one, They approached the building, turned their backs, and walked away. No violence, no destruction, just the repeated symbolic act of rejecting disrespect. Even in unexpected places, the movement found resonance. In London, students at Oxford and Cambridge universities held simultaneous dignity debates, discussing what President Traoré's actions meant for post-colonial international relations. In New York, the African Union offices received hundreds of flowers and letters of support from Americans of all backgrounds who had been moved by the UN footage. The global establishment, however, was not prepared for this level of unified response. Western media outlets scrambled to control the narrative, with headlines that seemed almost desperate in their attempts to minimize what had happened. Diplomatic misunderstanding at UN, read one major newspaper. Missed opportunity for dialogue, proclaimed another. Cultural differences lead to protocol breach, suggested a third, but the people weren't fooled. Social media users shared screenshot after screenshot of these headlines, often accompanied by the same comment. They still don't get it. Because what the world had witnessed wasn't a misunderstanding, wasn't a missed opportunity, wasn't a protocol breach. It was a moment of perfect clarity, a demonstration of what happens when respect is demanded rather than begged for. The international diplomatic community was in crisis. Former ambassadors and career diplomats found themselves struggling to categorize what they had witnessed. In my 40 years of diplomatic service, said a retired EU ambassador who spoke on condition of anonymity, I have never seen such composure under pressure. It was devastatingly effective. President Traoré didn't just reject the handshake. He redefined what diplomatic power looks like in the 21st century. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's silence in the days following the incident only deepened the crisis. No follow-up statements, no press conferences, no attempts at damage control. His media team, usually aggressive in their response to international criticism, seemed paralyzed by the simplicity and power of what had occurred. How do you spin a moment of such clarity? How do you control a narrative when the image speaks louder than any words? The still frame of President Traoré turning his back on Netanyahu's extended hand became the defining image of a new era in international relations. It was printed on T-shirts, shared as profile pictures, turned into artwork, and referenced in political science classrooms around the world. But perhaps most importantly, it became etched in the minds of young Africans everywhere as proof that their leaders could command respect on the world stage. This wasn't just a rejection of disrespect. It was a blueprint for dignity in the face of power. It was a masterclass in how to respond to condescension without lowering yourself to the same level. It was a demonstration that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all, just the simple act of walking away. And for young people across Africa and the African diaspora, it was revolutionary. For too long, they had watched their leaders be patronized, dismissed, or forced into positions of supplication on the international stage. They had seen African intelligence questioned, African capabilities doubted, and African dignity treated as negotiable in diplomatic exchanges. But President Traoré had changed all that with a single gesture. He had shown that respect isn't something you ask for. It's something you demand by how you carry yourself. He had proven that sometimes the most eloquent speech is silence, the most powerful argument is action, and the most effective diplomacy is simply knowing when to walk away. The ripple effects continue to this day. African leaders across the continent have adopted what diplomatic observers are calling the Traoré standard, a new baseline for how African nations engage with international partners. No longer is patience with disrespect considered diplomatic maturity. No longer is tolerance for condescension seen as political wisdom. The message has been sent, and the world has received it loud and clear. Africa is no longer willing to shake hands with disrespect. The age of dignified diplomacy has begun, and it started with one man who chose to walk away rather than compromise his principles. So wherever you are watching from, whether you're in Accra or Atlanta, Lagos or London, Nairobi or New York, remember this moment. Remember that respect is not negotiable, that dignity is not optional, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply turn around and walk away. The handshake that never happened changed everything, and the walk that followed it will be remembered forever.